There was a very beautiful home one time, and it was being burglarized, and two guys were just loading up the bags, having a good time. All of a sudden, they heard a voice. It said, "The Lord is with you." They got shook, shone the flashlight around, and they found a parrot in a cage. And one burglar said to the other, "It's just a stupid parrot. Keep loading the bags." They kept working at it. The parrot kept saying, "The Lord is with you." So he got the flashlight out again, and he shone it this time, and now lowered it a little bit. At the bottom of the cage is a great big Doberman. And the parrot said, "Sick 'em, Lord." Let's relate that story to our situation. The home is our country. The burglars are conspirators trying to destroy our country. The parrot is the awakening force. And the Doberman is you and all good Americans who will stop this conspiracy. My message this evening is simple. For many years, the proponents of world government have told us about their plans to destroy our country and terminate personal freedom. We should listen. The topic of my remarks, of course, is the planned free trade area of the Americas. But I want to put this very dangerous proposal into a context that should not be forgotten or ignored. Staying out of FTAA is essential, but if it can become widely known that this pact is merely a continuation, even a culmination, of plans that have existed for decades, then there will be enough Americans to get Congress to block it. Let's not forget that President Bush, backed by candidate Kerry, has announced plans to seek congressional approval for the FTAA early next year. As I refer to various documents and openly stated plans of our enemies, please realize that they have told us what they want, and they have also told us how they intend to get there. In 1961, for instance, taxpayer dollars paid for the State Department to have Professor Lincoln P. Bloomfield produce a document entitled "A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations." Imagine. If you were paying federal taxes in 1961, you helped to finance a plan to have the UN take over the world. Bloomfield's document called for mandatory universal membership of all nations. He worried that getting the communist bloc and the Western world into the same world government might be extremely difficult, so he advocated not defeating communism, but instead he wanted, quote, to transform and tame the forces of communism to the point where the present international system might be reshaped, close quote. Precisely at this very time, top communist defector Anatoly Golitsyn came to America and tried to warn our leaders that there would be a remarkable change in the communist world. Eventually, with a new, more attractive Soviet leader, with the Berlin Wall coming down, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, the KGB reformed, and a socialist Europe created. And all of that has come to pass. But Golitsyn met with ridicule from U.S. leaders and spent the rest of his life in hiding, fearful of retaliation, not from Soviet agents, but from enemies within the United States. He even made the mistake of seeking help from William F. Buckley Jr. and got nowhere. The State Department paid Bloomfield for his treasonous plan in 1961. It was published in 1962. The State Department and the CIA discounted Golitsyn's revelations, but also in 1961, the State Department issued Freedom from War, the U.S. program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world. also known as State Department Document 7277, it called for our nation and all nations to turn over their weaponry to the UN so that, quote, no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. How's that for an oxymoron? Peace force. Once again, taxpayers paid for an incredibly subversive document. Sad to say, much of what 7277 called for in its various steps has already been accomplished. Moving ahead, we come to 1970 and the publication of a book entitled Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. In it, he praised Marxism for 60-odd pages, claimed that our nation was becoming obsolete, called for central planning to replace the Constitution, and recommended as a major step toward world government the linking of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The links were then, according to Brzezinski, to be expanded to include more advanced communist states on the way to world government. It is noteworthy, however, that Brzezinski specifically called for the world government to be built piecemeal. This book was the genesis of the Trilateral Commission, formed by David Rockefeller and Brzezinski in 1973. From its original 3 regions, Trilateral Commission membership now includes bankers, political leaders, media heavyweights, ambassadors, former national leaders, and corporate bigwigs from almost the entire globe. Its goal of piecemeal transition of the planet to the UN-led world government continues. 4 years later, now we're in 1974, and we see Richard N. Gardner's remarkably treacherous article appearing in Foreign Affairs magazine, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. In it, Gardner boldly called for, quote, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. How many members of the Council on Foreign Relations resigned from their organization in protest over that urging by Gardner? You guessed it, none. Let's remember, however, that Brzezinski wanted the transfer of world government to be accomplished piecemeal, and Gardner said piece by piece. Obviously, they thought alike. But Gardner's 1974 article deserves a bit more attention because he listed 10 routes or agencies to bring about what he repeatedly termed was a UN world government and the surrender of sovereignty to the world body. Among those recommendations, we find the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, the Law of the Sea Conference, a UN-led communications monopoly, and more. While none of his suggested routes should be overlooked, it's important to know that the second of the 10 paths that he recommended, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT, is now the World Trade Organization. That was formed and that we joined in 1994. It was formed before that, but we joined it in 1994. GATT no longer exists, but the use of trade groups to destroy sovereignty and create world rule continues as Gardner had recommended. Well, let me pause here now. Let's summarize what we have pointed out. For decades, prominent U.S. leaders have been offering various suggested routes to a UN-led world government. Many of the pieces of their treasonous creation are already in place. Is it not accurate to conclude that the UN isn't taking us over? That instead, we are being delivered to the world body? Kofi Annan isn't our top enemy. Our own leaders are. And this is a very important concept. Leaders of our nation, along with the leaders of many other nations, are working to build the United Nations into an unchallengeable force that will be led by them. Not by any bureaucrat from Africa, like Annan, or someone as inconsequential as he truly is. We've been told by those who are delivering our nation to the UN what they really intend to do, and the several ways they will try to reach their goal. Never a direct insertion of the U.S. into the world government. They always recommend a piece by piece or a piecemeal process. Our current focus is the free trade area of the Americas. I believe it's safe to say that defeating the plans to entangle the U.S. into this web is as important a project as any we have undertaken in the history of the John Birch Society. And as already noted, those who want the FTAA to capture America have told us what they intend to accomplish. Planning for the FTA actually began with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement linking Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. When it was being proposed in 1993, Henry Kissinger authored a newspaper column stating that NAFTA would lead to a new world order. Of dramatic interest for us here today was his assertion that the pact will be, quote, the first step toward the even larger vision of a free trade zone for the entire Western Hemisphere. In other words, he told us that NAFTA, even before Congress dutifully passed legislation inserting our nation into it, was a precursor of the even larger FTAA. Also in 1993, before Congress approved NAFTA, David Rockefeller said of the pact, "Everything is now in place after 500 years to build a true new world in the Western Hemisphere." He obviously had no use for the 5 centuries since Columbus arrived on our shores, an era that saw the flowering of personal freedom and independent nations and limited government. But of importance here is the fact that he too saw NAFTA as the precursor of FTAA. NAFTA was to be a small but significant piece of the world government's puzzle. FTAA is a much larger piece. Even though it was clear from the statements issued by Kissinger and Rockefeller what NAFTA was intended to become, most Americans and most members of Congress were told that NAFTA was only about free trade. But the pact contains 900 pages of regulations. There's nothing free about 900 pages of regulations. Has it cost Americans their jobs? Yes, hundreds of thousands. Has it opened more widely our nation's borders? Yes, with 4,000 every day coming across our southern border virtually unimpeded. And they inspect me at the airports. Right? And Steve, and everybody. But has it diluted U.S. sovereignty? NAFTA. Emphatically yes. Including among those 900 pages the creation of a little-known NAFTA tribunal that has already issued rulings that supersede U.S. law. NAFTA is already more powerful than U.S. federal and state courts. In 1994, with NAFTA already on the books, the world planners got Congress to place the U.S. in the Geneva-based World Trade Organization. Once again, we were told what it really meant. Newt Gingrich, the supposed conservative leader in Congress, said this: "We need to be honest about the fact that we are transferring from the United States, at a practical level, significant authority to a new organization. This is a transformational moment," he said. And then he cooperated with Bill Clinton in 1994 to convene a lame duck session of Congress where he twisted arms and gained passage of legislation placing our nation in another of the pieces building the world government. The WTO has issued rulings against the U.S. regarding our tax laws, oil importation, cotton and sugar subsidies, even the price of bananas. The WTO is about trade, but its major consequence is significant chipping away at our national independence. In the year 2000, Congressman Ron Paul sought to have his colleagues vote to withdraw from the WTO. He said that, quote, "the most important reason why we should get out is to maintain our nation's sovereignty." But Congress defeated the Paul measure, and we're still trapped in the WTO. Proponents of NAFTA told us it was a step toward a future FTA. Congress went ahead and voted us into it. Proponents of the WTO told us it would compromise sovereignty, and Congress voted us into it. Even after becoming obvious that the WTO was attacking sovereignty, Congress refused to take us out of it. But my point is that there was fair warning about what these pacts would accomplish, just as there has been fair warnings for decades about the world government goal of our nation's most important leaders. Which brings us back to FTAA. It was first proposed 10 years ago at a summit of the Americas in Miami. Bill Clinton attended and applauded the idea. At this very meeting in 1994, FTAA promoters presented the FTAA's Declaration of Principles, which stated, "We reiterate our firm adherence to the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter." So, world government under the UN is the obvious goal on a long-range basis. We are again alerted if we have the good sense to listen to what is being said. Mr. Bush stated very clearly that NAFTA had been such a grand success that it ought to be expanded to include all of Latin America. But the Los Angeles Times recently asked an illegal immigrant from Mexico if NAFTA was good for Mexico. In a burst of absolutely unimpeachable logic, this man said, "If it were true that NAFTA was good for Mexico, we wouldn't be here." Let's run him for Senate. Good for him. Now FTAA's promoters liken us to the European Union. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Wall Street Journal have editorialized in favor of doing to the Western Hemisphere what the European Union has done for Europe. Mr. Bush's good friend, President Vicente Fox of Mexico, called for, quote, "an ensemble of connections and institutions similar to those created by the European Union." And the European Union, now containing 25 nations, has just published its yet-to-be-ratified constitution that concludes right up front that it, quote, "shall have primacy over the law of member states." Goodbye, independent nations of Europe. The newly proposed European Union Constitution repeatedly pays deference to the United Nations throughout its pages. What can be said of the EU? Simply, it already amounts to the greatest concentration of political power in the history of the world. And our own leaders tell us that they want the FTAA to be just like the European Union. Resistance is building in Europe, however, to the European Union, notably in England. One of the reasons for this resistance is Mikhail Gorbachev's statement during 2000 when he visited England. This man, who should be in a jail somewhere, said that the EU was Gorbachev in 2000 visiting England said the EU was, quote, "the new European Soviet." Even Gorbachev has told us what is intended for mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 191 nations in the UN. Taking control of each one at a time would be very difficult. So the world planners have created groups whose nations can be absorbed en masse. And this is what NAFTA, the WTO, the European Union, and the proposed FTAA are all about. Additionally, there are already other groups, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, and similar assemblages in Africa and Latin America. If you get the impression that the world is getting very close to being completely dominated by a powerful few, you get my message. But my other message, and most important message, is this. Blocking the FTAA should be the beginning of the end for the conspirators. Soon, members of Congress will face a choice. Choice one. They can reject the phony lure of free trade benefits and oppose the FTAA. Or two, they can have our nation commit suicide by transferring sovereignty to this important plank in the building of the New World Order's world government. How members of Congress will make this decision is up to each of us in this room, and especially to many others each of us can stimulate to contact their congressmen and senators about this very real threat. Now, pressures to support FTAA will undoubtedly come from the president, no matter who he is, the party leaders, the establishment's media, the corporate sellout artists, even some clergymen. But if members of Congress start hearing from many Americans, especially some who may never have contacted them previously but are now doing so because you alerted them, then members of Congress will think twice about approving FTAA. And no one in Congress should be overlooked. There are likely to be more Democrats than Republicans opposing the FTAA. Once enough in Congress say no to FTAA, they are primed for getting us out of the WTO, out of NAFTA, even out of the UN. This battle over FTAA should be the turning point we've all been looking for. Treat this project as the most important you have ever been involved in, because it is. Get yourself armed with pamphlets and videos and books and signs and tapes and start your own program to get this material into the hands of sleeping Americans. You will find ready acceptance for your efforts among most. The enemies of freedom have told us what they want. World government under the UN with them running it. And they have told us over and over again about the various routes they intend to travel to get there. The FTAA is their most important baby today. It must not be allowed to destroy the independence of our nation. Stop the FTAA. Thank you.